He sprinted into the banquet hall wearing boots made of glistening bronze. His eyes darted from side to side, as if invisible creatures were swarming around him. People whispered among themselves, wondering if he had finally lost his mind or if he was testing them again. He stopped in the center of the room and shouted at the top of his lungs, "I see them creeping on the walls. Catch them before they reach my plate." Everyone froze in fear because nobody could see anything out of the ordinary. Yet his voice boomed with absolute confidence. This king was known for the strangest displays of power. Some claimed he ate nothing but raw onions for breakfast. Others said he once demanded a bed carved from the trunk of the oldest tree in the land, only to grow bored and order it burned in front of the entire court. At times, he turned the palace into a stage for his wild imagination. If he woke up believing the sky had changed color overnight, he made the court painters climb onto the rooftops and coat every inch with a new hue. He insisted that the moon had sent him personal messages and that he could hear these messages through the howling of midnight winds. During his coronation, he shocked everyone by refusing the traditional crown. Instead, he commanded an artisan to create a bizarre headpiece from sharpened fish bones, dyed red and black. He wore it with pride and claimed it protected him from evil spirits. People who saw this fishbone crown up close said it smelled of the sea and had bits of scales still attached. Whenever he appeared in public, he patted the top of his head as if making sure the bones were still in place. His guards had no clue how to address such behavior, so they just nodded and pretended everything was normal. The strangest rumor was that he believed his reflection was haunted. He insisted that mirrors were gateways for wicked shadows. He avoided them completely and even banned them from the palace. This ban created havoc among the courtiers, who relied on mirrors to dress in their fancy garments and fix their hair. Some tried to sneak tiny reflective surfaces into hidden pouches, hoping to maintain their appearance in front of this unpredictable monarch. But if he caught even a hint of a mirror's glint, he flew into a frenzy, yelling about ghostly figures lurking inside the reflection. He also believed that laughter itself was suspicious if it didn't sound genuine. He forced his subjects to practice laughter drills. Servants, ministers, and even visiting dignitaries had to line up and produce hearty, booming laughter. If anyone's laugh sounded weak or unconvincing, he pointed an accusing finger and bellowed, "Treason." The terrified individual had to kneel and recite a bizarre pledge declaring their honest joy in serving such a noble ruler. People whispered that some unlucky souls were thrown into dungeons for having an off-sounding chuckle. No one ever felt safe around him. He had a habit of summoning a different guard each night for an inspection of the entire palace, from the wine cellars to the highest tower. These nighttime patrols could last for hours. Anyone who showed fatigue risked punishment for slacking in the face of invisible dangers. Servants claimed he often wore a peculiar device over his eyes during these patrols, some kind of lens that supposedly helped him see tiny demons crawling on floors and ceilings. He would jump back and point in horror at ordinary corners or cracks in the walls, yelling, "They're plotting against me here too." The guards had to keep a straight face and vow to capture these non-existent fiends. The king's obsession with illusions led him to create bizarre policies for public safety. Citizens were instructed to sprinkle salt outside their doors every morning to keep monsters at bay. Anyone who forgot received a public lecture by the local officials, reminding them of the monarch's direct orders. Tavern owners were forced to display large jars of spicy peppers to frighten away vaporous shapes that the king thought emerged from the night air. People complied out of sheer fear, even though most had no clue what these shapes were supposed to be. He took his paranoia to extremes when he demanded that every official document be signed with invisible ink. He reasoned that if his invisible enemies could read normal handwriting, invisible writing would thwart their plots. This measure caused chaos in the kingdom's bureaucracy. Messages went undelivered because clerks had no idea how to reveal the invisible text correctly. Ministers ended up losing track of major decisions, and local governors were left scratching their heads trying to decode blank pages. Meanwhile, the king laughed at the confusion, convinced he had outwitted his phantom adversaries. In his court, he had a special seat reserved only for what he called the silent advisor, This was nothing more than an empty throne next to his own. Whenever a serious matter arose, he paused to stare at that vacant seat as if expecting a wise counsel to appear from thin air. Courtiers waited in nervous silence, eyes glued to the king's face, trying to guess what unseen entity might be whispering advice to him. Sometimes, he abruptly nodded and announced a new policy, like banning the color green in public festivals, claiming it attracted ancient curses. Other times, he gasped in horror and canceled a planned celebration, insisting the silent advisor had foreseen disaster. His dinner parties were a sight to behold. He made sure every meal started with a huge gong strike, followed by a choreographed series of shrieks performed by his personal choir. These poor singers had to maintain eerie tones while the king sipped strange herbal concoctions. Servants would bring out dishes shaped like mythical creatures, decorated with glittering powders. The moment the plates touched the king's table, he would sniff the air suspiciously, as if expecting a monstrous smell. Then he devoured the food in swift bites, scanning the room for any signs of planted mischief. Everyone else ate quietly, hoping not to trigger his delusions. Guests at the palace never forgot his wild midnight dances either. He would order the court musicians to play haunting melodies, and then he'd leap around the hall, arms flailing, feet stamping. Courtiers had to join in, or be branded disloyal. The most unfortunate ones were chosen to wear costumes shaped like giant insects, which he claimed represented his darkest nightmares. People stumbled and bumped into each other, trying to appease this unpredictable ruler. At times, he burst into maniacal laughter in the middle of the dance, pointing at some poor soul and shouting, "They're one of them." Servants would quickly hustle that person away, though nobody knew where they ended up. Some believed he was cursed by a sorcerer from a distant land. Others speculated that he was traumatized by a childhood incident involving a wild beast. Rumors spread that his older brother was a gentle soul who was exiled for attempting to calm the king's fears. Nobody dared mention the brother's name, not even in whispers, for fear of incurring the ruler's wrath. It became a crime to speak of the old days or discuss the monarchy's lineage in too much detail. He was convinced family history was a path to resurrecting vengeful spirits. Officials who tried to reason with him faced swift penalties. One advisor recommended more practical security measures, like training additional guards or improving city gates, but the king scoffed at such suggestions. During one of his more grandiose displays, he ordered the entire city square to be transformed into a giant labyrinth filled with smoke and strange lights. Anyone entering had to solve riddles that made no sense. "Speak only in squeaks," one sign instructed. "Wear your shoes backward," read another. The labyrinth had dead ends guarded by men dressed as giant ravens who cawed fiercely at confused citizens. This fiasco lasted an entire month, leaving the kingdom's main trade routes blocked and frustrating merchants from neighboring lands. By that time, the people had grown weary of his madness, but fear kept them silent. Nobody dared challenge the king openly. The realm became a place of illusions, with each day more chaotic than the last. Yet as terrifying as his reign was, it also fascinated those who observed it from a distance. Other kings from far-off territories sent spies disguised as merchants, hoping to learn if these strange methods had some deeper logic. Instead, they returned with stories of nightly panics, frantic policies, and a ruler dancing in his fishbone crown under the pale moonlight. He left behind a peculiar legacy, one that made no sense in any rational world. Some claimed his final command was to rename every city after a dream he once had, an endless dream that haunted him for years. Others insisted he disappeared into the mountains, chasing shadows only he could see. Whatever truly happened, the stories lived on, painting him as the ultimate example of a king trapped in his own imagination. Even centuries later, people still shared terrifying tales of his twisted mandates, random punishments, and eerie laughter echoing through the corridors of a palace long crumbled into ruins. He was fear and fascination rolled into one, haunting everyone who stood in his presence. His constant paranoia shaped the kingdom in ways nobody could predict, and even when reality stared him in the face, he brushed it aside for his beloved fantasies. Those who served him prayed for relief, while outsiders watched with morbid curiosity. Yet through it all, one question remained. How did such a person ever hold power? The kingdom's chronicles never provided a clear answer, leaving us with stories of illusions, rumors of curses, and endless nights of dread. Prosody. He believed his own fingertips could spark lightning. Every time dark clouds gathered overhead, he rushed to the highest balcony, arms raised, waiting for a bolt from the heavens. Witnesses said he stood there for hours during storms, shrieking with excitement whenever lightning crackled in the distance. He'd exclaim, "My power calls the thunder," as if he was certain the skies obeyed him. When no lightning struck him directly, he claimed that only proved how much nature feared his might. People who worked under him sighed at yet another one of his peculiar fixations. This was the same ruler who once demanded that all doors in the palace be replaced with spinning wheels. Yes, spinning wheels. He thought regular doors were too predictable and gave potential assassins an easy way in and out. The result was a palace that resembled a circus maze. Courtiers had to push these giant, rotating contraptions to enter or exit any room. Many got stuck or fell over while trying to maneuver through them. Instead of increasing security, it turned simple tasks into comedic disasters. His court jester enjoyed a strange position of influence. The jester didn't just entertain, he also became the king's self-appointed scientific advisor. The king adored bizarre experiments, and the jester played along with every wacky idea. Together, they tried to create a potion that would let people stay awake for weeks. They mixed rare herbs, pungent spices, and even animal hair, boiling everything in a giant cauldron. The smell was nauseating, and some staff members fainted. Nobody dared question the sanity of it all, because the king firmly believed this brew would shape the future of warfare. He was obsessed with the idea that an army marching without sleep could conquer any enemy. At one banquet, he demonstrated his miracle potion by forcing a small group of soldiers to drink it in front of everyone. The soldiers gagged, coughed, and then stumbled around with glazed eyes. Instead of staying awake, they collapsed in a deep slumber that lasted 2 days. The embarrassed king lashed out, accusing them of sabotage. He declared that only the truly worthy could unlock the potion's potential. Still, he never gave up on perfecting his mysterious formula. He also believed he could communicate with wildlife by speaking in random hoots and hisses. On hunting trips, he insisted everyone remain silent while he tried to negotiate with deer or boars. He hopped around, waving his arms and muttering nonsense. If an animal ran away, he claimed it hadn't recognized his regal status. If the creature stayed put, the king took credit for forging a magical connection. Court chroniclers rolled their eyes, but recorded these tales in official documents, describing the king's unique bond with the forest. His official wardrobe was no less odd. He favored cloaks decorated with thousands of shiny pebbles. The heavier the cloak, the more he thought it radiated authority. Some weighed so much that he needed 2 attendants just to help him stand upright. But that didn't stop him from parading around, clanking like a walking gravel pit. People near him trembled at the thought that if he lost his balance, he might topple over and crush someone beneath the avalanche of stones. Then there was his talking chamber, a large dome-shaped room with echoing acoustics. He believed that if he shouted his questions to the walls, the echoes that returned were messages from ancient rulers. He would stand in the center and bellow, "Should I build a new fortress?" Then the echo came, "Build a new fortress. A new fortress. Fortress." He exclaimed, "You heard it speak. It is the will of the ages." Ministers grimaced, thinking of the skyrocketing costs of yet another fortress. Following user messages has been successful endeavors driving endless labor. Whenever he felt threatened by conspiracies, he ordered the palace floors to be coated with oil. And fortunately, this measure caused daily chaos for servants and officials. People tumbled left and right, dropping platters of food, scattering important papers, and twisting ankles. The king stood in the middle of it all, arms folded, smugly declaring that no enemy could remain on their feet in his presence. His punishment methods were equally strange. If someone displeased him, he made them wear oversized shoes filled with gravel for a week. He believed physical discomfort would cleanse them of sinful thoughts. Others had to drag large wooden ducks around the courtyard, honking them like musical instruments. Some faced a watery ordeal, where they had to sit in a tub of sour milk until they apologized for their crimes. Every punishment was so ludicrous that few dared risk his wrath. He forced his nobles to participate in elemental trials every year. One trial involved crossing a shallow pool of mud while balancing lit candles on their heads. Another required them to chant random words he insisted had mystical importance. The most extreme one involved standing in a ring of glowing coal for a few seconds. The king believed that anyone who could handle these trials without flinching was loyal. In reality, they just practiced in secret to avoid humiliating themselves in public. A bizarre side to his personality was his obsession with naming things. He renamed the streets in the capital after foods he liked. One winding avenue became Roasted Onion Lane, and the central boulevard was called Peppered Pork Parkway. The people had to adjust to these silly changes, and official maps had to be reprinted constantly. Visitors got lost, baffled by signs pointing to places like Sugary Cupcake Corner and Salty Fish Fountain. The king was delighted, saying made the city more memorable to foreigners. He also banned the use of the word maybe. He considered it a sign of weakness. Anyone caught saying maybe in his presence had to kneel and recite a phrase, "I will not hide behind uncertain words." This policy spread anxiety across every level of society. Artisans, merchants, and even generals avoided any hint of indecision in their speech. Deals were sealed hastily, orders were given without proper thought, and strategies lacked flexibility. The kingdom stumbled forward, driven by blind certainty imposed by a capricious ruler. He believed he possessed a direct link to the dreams of his ancestors. So every night, he demanded absolute silence in the palace, threatening to imprison anyone who made noise. Guards tiptoed like mice, servants held their breath while walking, and even the hounds were muzzled. Why? Because the king claimed that the softest sound might break his connection to the ancient dream world. The next morning, he woke with grand declarations about what he heard. In the night, usually instructions to build monumental structures or change the design of the royal crest. The crest went from a simple lion symbol to a chaotic image of swirling shapes, starry eyes, and various animals jumbled together. One day, he ordered a monument to be erected in honor of what he called the Great Realm of Slumber. This monument was shaped like a giant pillow, carved from marble, placed right in the city's main square. People questioned the cost and the reason behind this display. The king explained, "It honors the dreams that guide us." Meanwhile, workers struggled to maintain roads and public services because of budget cuts. The pillow statue sat there, glistening in the sun, a constant reminder of the ruler's eccentric priorities. His mania for illusions also extended into architecture. He wanted the entire palace to be mirrored on the outside, so it reflected the sky and disappeared from view. Builders tried to explain how impractical this was. Mirrors were fragile, expensive, and difficult to keep clean. The king ignored them and set a deadline for the project. Frantic engineers patched together a patchwork of reflective surfaces. It partially worked on sunny days, but strong winds blew off chunks of these mirrors, causing danger to passers-by below. This fiasco left the palace looking like a shattered crystal fortress. Yet the king found it glorious, proclaiming that a half-reflected palace was better than a plain stone building. He rarely thought of his subjects' well-being, yet claimed to love them more than any other ruler. The phrase, "I rule with my heart," echoed through the corridors, but in reality, daily life grew harsher. People had to adapt to nonsensical commands like painting their rooftops gold to confuse foreign invaders, or wearing hats covered with bright feathers to scare off evil spirits. These rules drained the kingdom's resources, but nobody could resist. It was all in service of their unpredictable monarch, who threatened to unleash bizarre punishments at the slightest objection. During festivals, he demanded acts that went beyond normal revelry. He once ordered an entire carnival to revolve around human-sized marionettes controlled by the royal guard. The guards had to dance these giant puppets around, accompanied by chanting crowds. Some described it as haunting and disturbing, but the king clapped and cheered, calling it a work of genius. Merchants tried to sell their wares amid the confusion, while visitors gawked at the oversized dolls with painted faces bobbing through the streets. In the midst of these strange festivities, the king announced he had discovered the secret to immortality. He wouldn't share details, but teased the court with hints about a hidden chamber. He boasted that only he and his jester knew the location of this eternal life device. Some suspected it was another hoax to keep everyone in awe. Yet the more gullible courtiers clung to every word, hoping for a glimpse of this miracle. The king's new obsession led him to proclaim that anyone who dared speak of death in his realm would be tried as a heretic. Funerals were renamed transitions, and mourning was outlawed. People had to celebrate even at the loss of loved ones, wearing forced smiles. The jester fueled the king's delusions by dressing up as an immortal spirit, painting his face white and chanting nonsensical phrases. He hopped around with a wand that glowed at the tip, claiming it harnessed celestial energy. Sometimes the king and jester held midnight rituals, lighting bonfires in the courtyard while they danced around them in swirling capes. The official record keepers had no logical explanation for these events. They simply recorded that the king engaged in ceremonies of celestial wonder. Despite all this, the kingdom staggered on, largely due to local governors who worked double time to keep basic systems running. Trade routes stayed open out of habit and necessity, though travelers returned with surreal tales of a realm on the brink of madness. They spoke of the spinning wheel doors, the battered mirror palace, and the monarchy's illusions about unstoppable power. Neighboring rulers heard these reports and chuckled or shuddered depending on their own beliefs. One of his boldest moves was insisting that the sun rose and set according to his will. Each morning he stepped onto the balcony, arms extended, commanding the sun to rise. Of course, it did so naturally, but the king insisted it was responding to his command. In the evening, he shouted for it to sink. When nights were especially long or short, he blamed minor rebellious thoughts in the hearts of his subjects. He claimed their lack of total loyalty delayed his cosmic influence. He even created a sunrise court and a sunset court, two sets of courtiers who had to stand at attention twice a day. They performed elaborate gestures to channel the king's power. This ritual cost a fortune in robes, flags, and props. Ministers quietly tried to manage the kingdom's finances, but with every new whim, the treasury took another hit. Meanwhile, the streets overflowed with citizens who struggled to follow decrees that seemed invented on a whim. The entire realm resembled a giant stage production that never ended. He refused to listen to reason from anyone outside his inner circle. Foreign ambassadors who came offering alliances or trade deals were forced to participate in bizarre rituals before any negotiations. Some had to balance an egg on their head while reciting lines from the king's favorite poems. Others had to wear comical masks and sing high-pitched tunes or risk insulting the monarch. Diplomats left with stories more suited to a carnival than a royal court. Yet somehow, this king believed he was destined for greatness. He commissioned monuments of himself, each statue featuring an outstretched hand summoning lightning from the skies. He turned a hill near the capital into a personal mountain retreat, carving his face into giant rocks. The local villagers were displaced, forced to relocate so the king's visage could be etched into the hillside. There were rumors he wanted his face on the moon, if he could find a way to reach it. He ended up spending fortunes on engineers who worked on outlandish projects like sky towers that might let him climb to the clouds. None succeeded, and many died in tragic accidents. But he dismissed these losses as mere stepping stones to immortality. Each failure sparked a new wave of bizarre decrees. If a tower collapsed, he claimed the building materials had been cursed and banned their use across the kingdom. This left entire stockpiles of timber and stone rotting away, while urgent construction needs went unmet. His final days were as strange as the rest of his rule. Some say he locked himself in the talking chamber for 3 days and nights, screaming for guidance from the echoes. Guards stationed outside heard him alternating between maniacal laughter and pitiful sobs. When he emerged, he was covered in soot for reasons nobody could explain. Without warning, He accused his favorite cousin of stealing his immortality secret. He had the poor relative dragged away in shackles. Immediately after, he proclaimed a day of celebratory parades. At those parades, the people marched wearing forced smiles, chanting slogans about the king's divine gifts. Soldiers tried to keep order, but crowds were restless. A hush fell when he appeared on a golden chariot, wearing a crown that sparked with small firecrackers he had attached to it. The sparks hissed and popped around his head. He roared at the crowd, "Behold your ruler, commander of storms and guardian of eternal life." Some people cheered out of fear. Others watched in grim silence, remembering the relatives who vanished under his reign. No grand explanation followed. He continued to rule in his twisted way, layering the kingdom with illusions and outlandish demands. People learned to keep their heads down, hoping for a better tomorrow or for him to lose interest in these schemes. Still, every day brought new madness. It was said that on some nights, lightning actually struck near the palace. When that happened, the king rushed outside with arms lifted high, convinced that his power was finally proven. And in that moment, no one could deny the spectacle of his raging silhouette, outlined by flashes of light, a living symbol of confusion and chaos. He sat on his throne wearing a cloak made of mismatched fabrics, each patch representing a fragment of his warped mind. This ruler had a fixation on changing his own name every month, insisting it reflected his evolving essence. Courtiers scrambled to keep up with the latest name so they didn't accidentally offend him by using an outdated title. If anyone dared slip up, he'd slam his scepter on the floor and holler, "Which fool ignores my transformation?" Then the unfortunate soul faced immediate punishment. His entire court revolved around his shifting personality. One day, he was cheerful and demanded constant music and dance. The next day, he'd be sullen, forcing everyone to wear gray clothes and speak only in whispers. People lived in a state of permanent anxiety, trying to guess the mood he'd adopt each morning. Some whispered that it wasn't a mood at all, but different entities possessing him. Others believed he was just toying with everyone's sanity. He promoted astrologers to high positions, trusting their cosmic predictions over any practical advice from seasoned ministers. If an astrologer insisted that the position of a certain star meant the kingdom needed new taxes, he'd sign an edict that very afternoon. The next day, another stargazer might claim that these taxes upset the planetary balance. So the king reversed the law. Citizens endured this seesaw of decrees with gritted teeth. He took joy in renaming months after his favorite things. One month was Colossal Banana, another was Hissing Beetle. People had no choice but to mark these absurd month names on official documents. Traders were baffled when they received receipts dated Hissing Beetle, Day 15. Diplomats from abroad shook their heads, unsure how to interpret such nonsense. But the king was proud of his whimsical calendar, saying it captured the true spirit of his reign. He also forced the royal tailors to design hats that represented his dreams. If he dreamt of floating eyeballs, he wanted hats with large eyeball ornaments. If he dreamt of a roaring dragon, he demanded hats with scaly patterns and fiery tassels. Anyone who refused to wear these hats in court risked being labeled a traitor. Official gatherings turned into surreal costume parties, with nobles trying to balance massive, absurd headpieces on their heads. His appetite was no less dramatic. He insisted on tasting the strangest dishes, from stew made of pickled fruit skins to bread dyed electric blue with rare flower petals. Chefs toiled day and night, inventing recipes to satisfy his bizarre cravings. He often changed his preferences with no warning, sending entire kitchens into chaos. One day, he declared all meats must be eaten raw. The next day, he ordered that vegetables could only be served boiled until they turned mushy and colorless. Royal banquets became dreaded events for everyone except the king, who cackled at the confusion. He was also haunted by a fascination with living dolls. He imported lifelike dolls from distant lands, paying astronomically high prices. Then he made his servants dress these dolls, feed them miniature meals, and even read them bedtime stories. Whenever a doll got damaged, he wept inconsolably, accusing his staff of unforgivable negligence. Some rumors claimed he secretly believed these dolls held fragments of his ancestors' souls, though no one dared to ask him directly. Stranger yet, he had a special hall built where every wall was covered with reflective surfaces. Not exactly mirrors, some were polished metal, others were glass-tinted in odd colors. He called this the Hall of Honest Shapes, claiming it revealed a person's true nature. Courtiers were forced to walk through it whenever the king felt suspicious. He'd watch their reflections shift, warping in the colored glass, and declare them guilty or innocent based on whatever shapes he saw. People who emerged looking too elongated or too twisted risked arrest for secret sins. He believed that nightmares were a form of counsel. To ensure he always had fresh nightmares, he commissioned the most gruesome plays performed in his private theater every night. Actors reenacted horrifying tales with blood-soaked costumes, monstrous masks, and eerie chanting. After each performance, he nodded with a glazed look, saying, "Yes, I shall dream well tonight." Meanwhile, some actors reported nightmares of their own, traumatized by the twisted scripts. But the king adored the theater, praising it as an endless source of wisdom. He hated whistling because he thought it could summon malevolent spirits. If anyone was caught whistling in his presence, he'd jump back, eyes wide, and command the guards to seize them. The whistler faced a ritual cleansing that involved washing their mouth with foul-smelling herbs, then reciting a vow never to whistle again. This ban on whistling extended to the entire kingdom, forcing traveling musicians to avoid certain notes in their performances. One of his strangest laws required that all official letters end with a random exclamation of his choice. The options changed weekly. Sometimes it was, "Rattlesnakes forever," other times, "May the onions dance." The logic behind these phrases remained a mystery, but ignoring them was punishable by fines or imprisonment. Messengers dreaded memorizing the king's ever-changing exclamations. They had to double-check every letter before sealing it, terrified of forgetting the required line. He also developed a fear of the color purple. He claimed it triggered dark visions and invited curses into his domain. This paranoia grew so intense that he outlawed purple clothing, paintings, and even flowers. At one point, his men uprooted entire fields of purple lavender, burning them in massive bonfires. Merchants had to discard any fabric dyed in that hue, losing fortunes overnight. Violet skies at dusk made him pace around, trembling, barking orders to shutter all windows until the sky changed color. Any mention of distant lands set off his fury. He believed foreign countries were illusions meant to trick him. If travelers arrived with gifts or stories, he labeled them liars unless they pledged total allegiance to his worldview. Maps of regions beyond his borders were burned, replaced by a single map that showed his kingdom at the center of a blank expanse. He told his people they were the only civilization in existence, which confused merchants who clearly traded goods with folks from other places. He had a particular fondness for mechanical gadgets. He paid inventors to create contraptions that made no practical sense. One inventor showed him a machine that blew soap bubbles continuously. The king demanded 10 more of these bubble machines, which he lined up in the great courtyard, giggling like a child at the floating orbs. Another gadget he commissioned was a massive device that rang tiny bells whenever someone sneezed within 50 paces. This invention proved disastrous in crowded areas, with bells chiming non-stop and driving people mad. He was convinced that geometry held the key to absolute power, so he forced his architects to build public squares in perplexing shapes, triangles, pentagons, and spirals that made no sense for daily use. Streets would curve unexpectedly, leading to dead ends in the shape of swirling patterns. This architectural chaos frustrated citizens, merchants, and visitors. But the king praised these designs, claiming they would trap evil energies. Meanwhile, city life became a labyrinth of confusion. He welcomed foreign performers if they showcased the weirdest acts. Fire eaters, contortionists, and sword swallowers received invitations to entertain him. He watched them with unblinking fascination, sometimes demanding to learn their skills. He tried fire eating once and nearly burned his eyebrows off, blaming the performer for faulty teaching. Undeterred, he forced a contortionist to share secret techniques. When he failed to twist his body into extreme poses, he declared the contortionist a fraud. He often changed the national motto without warning. One week, it was "We stand in odd unity." The next, we spiral toward triumph. Official buildings had to be repainted to display the current motto. Village elders, scribes, and travelers had to memorize each update or risk punishment. Just as they got used to one motto, he changed it again, sometimes scribbling an idea on a scrap of parchment and handing it to his heralds in the middle of the night. His approach to warfare was equally absurd. Instead of letting generals plan battles, he chose strategies based on random omens. If he saw a flock of birds flying east, he'd send troops in that direction. If a dog barked 3 times at sunrise, he'd cancel a campaign altogether. Military leaders were baffled, but had no choice. They followed instructions, venturing into pointless skirmishes or retreating at the most illogical moments. Fortune sometimes favored them, and the king boasted of his supernatural wisdom. At court, he introduced a practice called emotional roll call. Each morning, nobles had to declare their mood before the throne. If their mood displeased him, he demanded they change it immediately. Those who refused were confined to solitary rooms, forced to listen to monotonous droning sounds until they adjusted their emotions. This twisted method of control forced people to pretend to be joyful, even when they were on the brink of despair. He surrounded himself with fortune-tellers who used strange methods, like interpreting the patterns in thrown sticks or analyzing the shapes of melted wax. One predicted the king would one day harness the power of comets. That sent him into a frenzy, ordering astronomers to track every comet in the skies. He demanded that catapults be built to catch a comet's tail. Any attempt to explain the impossibility of this was dismissed as negativity. The project wasted huge amounts of labor and resources, leaving catapults rusting in remote fields. In his quest for eternal excitement, he forbid nights to be too quiet. He ordered large drums to be beaten at certain intervals, even in small villages, to remind everyone of his unstoppable energy. People complained of sleeplessness, but the king insisted it kept them vibrant. As a compromise, officials tried muffling the drums, but when the king found out, he accused them of conspiring to dull the spirit of his realm. One day he issued a decree that all birthdays must involve a parade of at least 20 dancers in animal masks, plus a fireworks display. Families struggled to afford such celebrations. Some tried to hold modest parades, but the king's inspectors roamed the land, checking the number of dancers. If there weren't enough, the family faced fines or confiscation of property. This bizarre law forced people to pool resources for group parties, filling roads with multiple parades each day. On paper, it looked like a kingdom of endless merriment, but in reality, it was a financial nightmare. He also insisted that the wind carried messages from mystical realms. Whenever a gust blew, he pressed a conch shell to his ear, listening intently. If he heard a faint whistle, he took it as a sign to restructure the entire royal court. Ministers found themselves demoted or promoted without reason. Some were tasked with meaningless projects, like mapping the shapes of clouds or counting ants in the palace garden. This was how he kept everyone busy and constantly guessing. Yet, in the midst of all the madness, he considered himself a kind and generous king. He distributed small gifts to random peasants, trinkets like carved figurines or little bottles of colored sand. These gestures felt like hollow charity compared to the suffering his eccentricities caused. But he believed these tokens made him beloved by the masses. People often accepted them with forced smiles, dreading his next whim. He claimed his ancestry traced back to a mythical era, when humans could communicate with gods directly. He used that claim to justify his strangest orders, saying he was simply reviving forgotten traditions. He even built shrines filled with bizarre statues combining human and animal features. He demanded daily offerings of unusual items, like carved fruit shaped into spirals or candles that sparked with colored flames. Priests who oversaw these shrines had no clue what significance these rituals held, but they complied to avoid punishment. His reign was a swirling storm of odd customs, random laws, and outlandish theatrics. No one dared predict what would happen next. The only certainty was that life under his rule meant constant upheaval. People looked out their windows each morning, bracing for new announcements. Maybe he'd ban trees that day, or declare a new language made of whistles and clicks. Every sunrise brought fresh waves of disbelief and worry. In the corners of the kingdom, Folks told stories of earlier days, when the monarchy was stable. Quiet discontent spread among officials, who still remembered a time before these twisted edicts. But fear kept them silent. It was dangerous to speak of the king's madness, more dangerous to challenge it. So they let the illusions continue, even as families went broke, staging forced parades and wearing bizarre hats shaped by a man's dreams. He rose each day with renewed vigor, like a child in a world built just for him. The people tiptoed around his illusions, hoping to survive another day without attracting his attention. His bizarre appetite for novelty shaped every corner of the kingdom, and all the while he paraded around, changing his name, changing the laws, changing the environment, and leaving everyone else struggling to keep up with an ever-shifting reality. He despised clothing that didn't sparkle. Every robe, every garment he wore had to glitter under torchlight. He believed the shimmering effect intimidated his enemies. Court seamstresses sewed countless tiny crystals onto every piece of fabric he owned, turning the royal wardrobe into a dazzling nightmare. Servants squinted whenever he approached, because the reflections were almost blinding under the palace lanterns. This king built a massive aviary right inside the palace walls, stocking it with exotic birds from across the seas. He spent hours perched on a cushioned seat, watching the birds squawk and flutter. Some said he trusted the birds more than his own advisors. He even held small councils there, forcing officials to talk over the loud screeching. Whenever he didn't like what someone said, he'd throw a handful of birdseed at them, shrieking, "The birds demand your silence." He had an unsettling fascination with unpredictable punishments. If someone displeased him, he chose the penalty by spinning a large wheel covered in random ideas. The wheel's wedges read things like, "Dance on hot stones," "Wear a goat's head for a day," "Clean the royal latrine with a spoon," and worse. People often fainted the moment the wheel began to spin. The king laughed gleefully at their fear, convinced he had invented a perfect system of justice. He also possessed a strange mania for changing the palace layout every few months. He'd order walls torn down, corridors blocked, and new staircases built in random places. Courtiers literally got lost on their way to meetings. The workers couldn't keep track of the ever-shifting blueprints. Dust and debris filled the hallways, making the palace a maze of incomplete structures. The king roamed around with a smug grin, praising the freshness of the design each time a new archway collapsed. He introduced a bizarre form of currency at one point, shells. He claimed precious metals carried negative energies, so he replaced all gold and silver coins with seashells. This caused chaos for merchants, who had to carry bags of fragile shells that easily cracked. Foreign traders scoffed, refusing to accept such flimsy payment. The kingdom's economy plummeted, yet the king insisted everyone keep using shells, saying it made the land more spiritually pure. He often replaced his normal guards with groups of mimes. He found their silent presence amusing. Imagine the shock of visitors entering the throne room to see guards in striped outfits and white face paint standing like statues. When the king gave a command, these mimes launched into exaggerated pantomime routines. Criminals being escorted to the dungeon found themselves guided by silent gestures, no words spoken at all. People questioned the practicality of this arrangement, but the king only giggled at the confusion. Not only did he ban normal forms of entertainment, but he also created a special spectacle he called Feast of Chaos. At this event, he served dishes in random order, desserts first, then soups, then appetizers, then main courses. Guests had to change seats every time a gong sounded, creating a constant swirl of confusion. Musicians played clashing tunes, and jugglers flung items wildly. The king roared with laughter, delighting in the disarray he caused among his nobles. He published a series of royal edicts he referred to as truth bombs. These edicts were rambling declarations about odd subjects, like the shape of one's ears predicting loyalty, or the importance of sleeping with one's head pointed west. Citizens had to memorize these statements, reciting them at random inspections. Anyone who failed to remember a specific line about ear shapes or sleeping positions risked punishment. Booksellers were forced to dedicate entire shelves to these truth bombs, even though most were completely nonsensical. He forced the royal cartographers to draw new maps showing rivers flowing upward and mountains shaped like spirals. When cartographers tried to explain that this misled travelers, the king brushed them off, declaring, "Reality is what I choose it to be." The result was a kingdom full of utterly useless maps. Some travelers got lost for days. The king simply shrugged, saying, if they got lost, they lacked faith in his vision. A peculiar craving overtook him every few weeks. He insisted on bathing in peculiar substances: milk, wine, honey, or even melted butter. Entire storerooms were emptied to fill large bathing tubs for him. Servants had to wipe up the sticky residue afterward while he lounged in a robe smelling of sour dairy or stale grape. He convinced himself these baths rejuvenated his spirit, proclaiming each time, "I am reborn anew." One of his most shocking acts involved the royal menagerie. He ordered the release of ferocious animals into the throne room during festivals. Guests gasped as lions and bears wandered among the courtiers. He believed this tested everyone's courage and loyalty. Any sign of panic could be seen as betrayal. When accidents happened, and they did, he blamed the victims, saying they lacked the resolve to serve him properly. People stood trembling, making no sudden moves while beasts sniffed around them. He once decided that all music must include the sounds of crashing pots. Musicians had to incorporate at least 2 pot smashes into every composition. Court performances sounded like chaotic kitchen disasters, with violins drowned out by banging metal. Some ministers tried to argue for more refined tunes, but he insisted on the pot-smashing rule, calling it a symbol of raw energy. Over time, the palace's collection of pots depleted, forcing the kingdom's artisans to make thousands more. He was unpredictable with alliances. One moment, he declared eternal friendship with a neighboring realm. The next, he accused them of scheming to steal his dreams. Ambassadors found themselves welcomed with grand feasts, only to be kicked out days later. Treaties were signed and then torn up. He made demands for bizarre tributes like barrels of pink sand or crates of glowing mushrooms. When other rulers questioned his sanity, he threatened to send an army of mimes. His perspective on justice was equally wild. He loved turning trials into theatrical performances, complete with costumes, stage props, and dramatic scripts. Lawyers had to deliver their arguments as poems or songs, while judges wore masks of comedy or tragedy. Defendants had to improvise lines proclaiming their innocence. Sometimes the king abruptly changed the storyline, casting the defendant as a villain in a twisted play. People groaned under this mockery of justice, but he adored the spectacle. He spent huge amounts of money on illusions, hiring illusion masters to perform stunts at court. They conjured floating lights, moving shadows, and other trickery. The king was certain these illusions tapped into secret portals. He bragged that the palace was a gateway to unseen dimensions. Some illusions spooked the nobles so much that they fainted. The king found it hilarious, boasting he controlled powers beyond mortal comprehension. A personal obsession with gemstones led him to demand gem-studded furniture. Beds, chairs, tables, everything had to be encrusted with rubies, emeralds, and sapphires. This display of wealth was breathtaking, yet painfully uncomfortable for anyone who dared sit down. People perched gingerly on spiky jewels, trying not to tear their clothes. The king sprawled out, unbothered by the lumps, convinced he radiated majestic energy with every glint of the stones. He turned national holidays into week-long frenzies, where each day carried a nonsensical theme. On Upside Down Day, everyone had to wear their clothes backward. On Silent Shout Day, people had to scream without making sound, an impossible feat that led to comedic pantomimes. On Invisible Food Day, everyone pretended to eat meals that weren't there, bowing to empty plates. The madness exhausted the people, but the king found it endlessly entertaining. An incredibly peculiar custom he introduced was the once-a-month Royal Rumble, where nobles wrestled each other in a muddy arena. Losers had to serve as footstools for the winners during the subsequent council meeting. This humiliating ordeal was meant to keep the nobility active and humble, but it mostly bred resentment. The king sat above it all, cheering like a child at a circus, ignoring the strained alliances and bruised bodies. He took personal pride in his shadow proclamations. At random times, he'd cast a shadow on the wall and interpret its shape as a divine command. If his silhouette looked like it had a long arm, he might decree expansions into neighboring lands. If it appeared short and squat, he might call for a cull of the palace livestock, claiming they needed to lighten the realm's burdens. People soon dreaded sunset, knowing the king might spot some bizarre shape in his shadow. He once declared that the kingdom's symbol would be a three-headed goose. This new emblem adorned flags, shields, and official seals. People struggled to figure out why he chose such an odd bird, and in triplicate form. The king simply said it came to him in a vision, which he trusted more than any logic. Merchants had to pay artisans to rebrand their wares with this goose image, fueling frustration across the land. Notorious for impulsiveness, he traveled with an enormous entourage, unannounced, to random villages. He might appear at your doorstep in the middle of the night, demanding to see a juggling act, or requesting a midnight picnic. His visits caused panic, as everyone rushed to cater to him. He claimed these surprise inspections kept people on their toes and weeded out laziness. Villagers dreaded hearing the royal horns echo in the dark. At one point, he started a personal crusade against yawning. He insisted yawning let evil spirits slip into one's throat. Whenever he caught someone yawning, he forced them to wear a wooden beak over their mouth for a full day, claiming it would block out evil. This bizarre measure led to stifled yawns in the palace, leaving people red-faced and teary-eyed from trying to hold them in. The king wandered around, proudly pointing out the beak-wearers as examples of vigilance. Despite all these eccentricities, he genuinely believed he was the wisest man to ever sit on that throne. He wrote a series of rambling philosophical scrolls filled with contradictory statements and puzzling claims. He commanded scholars to memorize his writings, threatening to destroy entire libraries if they refused. Some scholars tried to interpret his words, but they quickly realized the text had no consistent message. It was just random nonsense, with grandiose declarations sprinkled throughout. His rule lasted longer than anyone expected, mostly because his intimidation tactics worked. People complied out of sheer terror. He kept an extensive network of informants, urging commoners to report any sign of dissent. Harsh punishments awaited those who dared criticize him. Yet he considered himself loved, pointing to the forced celebrations and the deafening cheers at his public appearances, never realizing fear, not adoration, was the real cause. At lavish feasts, he boasted about visiting celestial realms in his sleep, claiming cosmic beings praised his brilliance. He had personal scribes record his astral dialogues, which were basically recountings of bizarre half-remembered dreams, but the king treated these documents as sacred texts, storing them in golden vaults under heavy guard. Anyone who doubted the authenticity of these celestial conversations risked charges of blasphemy against the crown. He once demanded a new music genre be created to honor his voice. Court composers struggled to craft tunes that matched his sporadic singing style, which ranged from awkward warbles to sudden shouts. He insisted on leading these performances, off-key and unpredictable. Audiences feigned rapture, clapping wildly to avoid his anger. After each show, he claimed the applause proved he was a genius musician. Official ceremonies ended with the release of colorful foam that the king believed represented his swirling spirit. Palace staff blasted jets of foam into the air, showering everyone with sticky suds. People stumbled around, coughing and spluttering. The foam got in their hair, their eyes, and stained their clothes. He simply laughed, calling it a baptism in creativity. This became a frequent occurrence, dreaded by all but the king himself. The strangest part was his unwavering confidence. In his mind, every strange policy made perfect sense. He thought himself destined to guide the kingdom into a new era of wonder. Outsiders saw only a realm in constant uproar, battered by impractical rules. Yet the king pressed on, convinced of his magnificence and untroubled by the chaos he spread everywhere he went. He hated the ground. Yes, the very ground beneath his feet. He declared that soil was an insult to his royal dignity. People watched, baffled, as he commissioned an intricate network of raised walkways across every inch of the palace and its gardens. He refused to let his shoes touch dirt, claiming it robbed him of his energy. Workers toiled day and night, hammering boards into place, creating platforms over flower beds, fountains, and even the palace courtyard. He strutted around these elevated paths, gazing down at the earth with contempt. His advisors tried to reason with him, suggesting that the cost of these elevated walkways was too high. But the king snapped, "I will not stand on that filthy surface." So they built more ramps, more bridges, more balconies. The entire palace complex became a sprawling maze of wooden platforms, towering above the ground. Servants had to lug everything up narrow flights of stairs to reach the king's new level. Anyone caught stepping onto actual soil in his presence risked immediate punishment. He also believed that standing higher gave him a spiritual advantage over potential enemies. He insisted that conspirators lurking in secret tunnels couldn't plot effectively against someone who refused to be at their level. Guards found themselves patrolling these elevated pathways, peering nervously over railings. One misstep meant tumbling into the rose bushes below. Visitors arrived and nearly fainted when they saw the bizarre architecture, a palace lifted on a shaky web of planks. While the palace soared above the ground, his mind wandered even higher. He became obsessed with the color white. He forced all palace decor to match his idea of purity. Walls were repainted in stark white, floors were bleached, and tapestries, he called them picture rags to avoid fancy words, were removed if they weren't plain enough. Curtains, tablecloths, even the servants' uniforms, everything had to be white. Ministers complained of eye strain, but he argued that any color other than white distracted him from his heavenly focus. He once banned all talking at sunrise, declaring that the first hour of each day belonged solely to his internal dialogue. During that hour, no one could speak, cough, or even sneeze loudly. Courtiers tiptoed around, pressing hands to their mouths to stifle any noise. The moment someone slipped up and muttered a greeting, the king would glare, proclaiming they had violated the sacred hush. Punishments ranged from forced fasting to scrubbing the raised walkways with a rag until sundown. His mealtimes became legendary for their sheer extravagance. He demanded entire feasts served on floating platforms in indoor ponds. Architects had to design special pools throughout the palace, each fitted with rafts that held tables and chairs. Servants paddled around with trays of roasted meats, sweet pastries, and exotic fruits. One unfortunate slip, and an entire platter could topple into the water, prompting the king to roar about wet treachery. Some claimed he simply enjoyed watching his staff struggle to maintain balance around him. He also decided that the standard writing system was too restrictive, so he created a twisted alphabet, filled with squiggles, zigzags, and random dots. Scribes had to learn it in a hurry, rewriting every official document to please the king. This new script confused everyone, leading to major administrative errors. Merchants complained that contracts were unmeetable, and local governors tore their hair out trying to decipher orders. But the king insisted that his new writing was divine, promising it would unite the kingdom in mystical understanding. Instead, it fueled endless chaos. He believed animals could sense loyalty better than any human. So he placed dogs, cats, parrots, and even goats in critical positions around the palace. One hall was lined with caged birds that squawked whenever someone entered. The king claimed he understood their cries, and if the birds screeched too loudly, he took it as a sign of betrayal. Elsewhere, goats roamed freely, chewing on table legs or nibbling at documents. Anyone who objected to these animals got labeled a traitor for rejecting the king's trusted advisors. He once decided to rename the kingdom's official language based on the sound of thunderstorms. He claimed thunder was the voice of the skies, and so he forced the entire court to mimic rumbling noises when they spoke. Conversations became a ridiculous chorus of grum, and so on, with courtiers trying to weave actual words in between guttural growls. Outside the palace, people tried to keep up, but it quickly became impractical. Traitors gave up altogether, reverting to normal speech once they were out of earshot. His laws changed on a whim, often to reflect his latest dream. If he dreamt of giant flowers attacking him, he might outlaw certain floral patterns in clothing. If he dreamt of floating fish, he'd require fishermen to shout, "Swim free," before casting their nets. Every morning brought a flurry of frantic changes, with heralds running through the streets, bellowing the new decrees. By noon, the king sometimes forgot the details, leading to contradictory commands that left citizens in a constant state of confusion. He turned the royal treasury into a personal workshop for bizarre inventions. Alchemists, fortune-tellers, and tinkers converged in a whirlwind of madness. He funded research into potions that supposedly let people speak with ghosts, machines that could compress air into solid shapes, and other impossibilities. The king strolled around these labs, poking at contraptions, offering outlandish suggestions, like harnessing the power of a rainbow. Whenever experiments failed, he blamed the staff for lacking cosmic ambition. One day, he declared that every gate in the city walls must be replaced with massive arches made of living vines. Gardeners tried to explain that vines would wither if uprooted, but he only heard what he wanted. So they created elaborate scaffolding of roots and tendrils. When the vines eventually died and crumbled, the king raged, convinced it was sabotage. He forced the gardeners into a trial by water, where they had to wade through a muddy stream while balancing fruit baskets on their heads. The spectacle was absurd, but nobody dared protest. He claimed to receive daily guidance from a radiant orb that hovered near his bed at night. He insisted it whispered secrets about his ancestors and foretold future events. Courtiers were commanded to stand guard, hoping to catch a glimpse of this orb. Nobody ever saw anything, but the king remained convinced. If a guard spoke up saying there was no orb, the king accused them of spiritual blindness. Soon, everyone pretended to believe, whispering to one another that the king's illusions were spiraling out of control. He took a bizarre approach to national defense. He replaced certain battalions of soldiers with troops of dancers, dressed in bright costumes. He believed that choreographed movements could confuse an enemy more effectively than swords. Generals tried to reason that dancing didn't stop arrows, but he scoffed at their old-fashioned thinking. So, lines of high-stepping performers practiced day and night, their bright outfits fluttering in the wind. Nobody was sure if this was a deterrent or an invitation to be invaded. He insisted that every citizen plant a small flag in front of their home, symbolizing the unity of madness and order. The design featured a spinning spiral at the center, surrounded by abstract shapes that made no sense. Tailors worked overtime to produce these flags, and inspectors roamed neighborhoods checking compliance. Some families couldn't afford the cloth, so they painted the symbol on rags or thin paper. The king praised them for their resourcefulness, ignoring the growing resentment. Whenever the moon was full, he organized a midnight choir on the rooftop of the palace. Hundreds of terrified courtiers had to climb the rickety steps and sing eerie tunes to welcome the celestial glow. The king stood at the highest point, arms outstretched, howling at the moon as if expecting a response. Occasionally, thick clouds covered it, and he roared that the choir must not be singing loud enough. That night's punishment involved each person wearing a chain of rocks around their neck, dragging them across the elevated walkways until dawn. He once got the idea to create a second capital city in the sky. He called it Cloud's Landing. He commanded engineers to design giant balloons that could lift entire sections of the palace into the air. Plans were drawn, and resources poured into building huge, colorful balloons. But these contraptions never managed to hoist more than a few pieces of furniture. Undeterred, he ordered more balloons, more ropes, more scaffolding. Eventually, the wind blew them all away or tore them to shreds, leaving the idea of Cloud's Landing a distant fantasy. He blamed his staff for not believing hard enough. He held an annual festival called the Festival of Mirrors, where everyone had to carry a reflective surface throughout the day. Vendors sold polished metal plates, shards of mirrored glass, or even bowls of water for a makeshift reflection. The king claimed that seeing one's own face continuously prevented dishonesty. In truth, it created a sea of flickering lights and bright glares that disoriented people. Pickpockets took advantage, slipping away while victims squinted at their reflections. He believed the entire kingdom should learn to juggle. He declared juggling a necessary life skill, insisting it built coordination and trust. Schools introduced juggling lessons. and officials mandated that any public event must include a juggling demonstration. People groaned, dropping items left and right. The city squares echoed with the sound of apples, balls, and random objects hitting the cobblestones. But the king was delighted, praising those who managed a few successful tosses. His dread of the unknown next door led him to order city walls expanded every year. The walls crept outward, swallowing farmland and forests, forcing villagers to relocate. He claimed that if the walls stopped expanding, hidden threats would swarm in. Builders complained they didn't have enough materials or manpower, but the king brushed them off, telling them to salvage pieces from old structures. Many quaint neighborhoods vanished under the relentless sprawl of these pointless fortifications. He demanded that every noble family keep a personal shout crier, a servant who stood beside them at all times, ready to yell on their behalf. The king believed that a good, loud shout could resolve conflicts instantly, so he wanted nobles prepared to outshout any trouble. Banquets turned into deafening affairs, with multiple criers hollering across the table. Guests left with ringing ears, while the king applauded what he called healthy discourse. Even so, meaningful conversations became impossible. He outlawed the use of normal pillows, insisting everyone sleep on slabs of marble or wooden boards. He claimed soft pillows made the mind weak, while hard surfaces sharpened one's wits. Furniture makers scrambled to produce these rigid pillows, which were basically polished blocks. People woke up sore and grumpy, but the king raved about his glorious sleep, claiming he had never been more alert. Rumors spread that he secretly lined his own block with cushions, though no one dared inspect the royal bed. He had a council of prophet children, young kids plucked from local schools, forced to sit in special seats during official assemblies. The king believed children possessed unfiltered wisdom. Whenever he faced a tough decision, he'd ask the children for advice. They usually mumbled random statements about candy or toys, but the king treated these words like prophecy. Ministers had to interpret lines like, "I want a sweet pastry," as a grand political strategy, drafting policies around these childish remarks. He attempted to build an army of mechanical knights, convinced that gears and metal plates could replace human soldiers. Blacksmiths and inventors spent countless hours forging clunky automaton prototypes. The contraptions lurch around, often collapsing mid-step. Still, the king boasted that he was pioneering the future of warfare. When the machines toppled in a demonstration, he claimed it was only a temporary setback. Then he poured even more resources into the project, ignoring urgent matters like failing crops. At official receptions, he arranged the chairs in a spiral pattern around him, forcing guests to weave awkwardly through the coils just to greet him. He said this layout mirrored the cosmic arrangement of the stars. Foreign dignitaries nearly tripped over each other, while the king smirked, believing he was enlightening them with higher truths. After the fiasco, many envoys left early, their patience worn thin by the endless hoops they had to jump through. He prided himself on having a royal grin of destiny. If he grinned at you, he expected immediate gratitude. Courtiers had to bow and thank him for the honor of his grin. Anyone who didn't react quickly enough faced a lecture about ingratitude. People watched him warily, terrified they might miss the fleeting moment he flashed his smile. Those who fawned over him received meaningless titles like Knight of the Golden Grin, a name that carried no real authority. His theatrical side also extended to how he introduced new laws. He'd bring out an ornate box, claiming it held the spirits of wise ancestors. He'd dramatically open it, pulling out a random scroll that detailed some bizarre mandate. It could be anything from banning the use of umbrellas to requiring citizens to wear mismatched socks on certain days. He insisted the box was magical and never repeated a law. Observers suspected he or his jester simply stuffed it with absurd ideas ahead of time. He forced his generals to practice interpretive dance as a way of planning military campaigns. Maps on tables were replaced by colorful rugs. Generals had to express strategies through fluid movements, twirls, and leaps. This approach led to disastrous confusion among the troops, who never knew if a spin meant flank the enemy or retreat immediately. The king, however, found these dance sessions inspiring, calling them the choreography of victory. Every fountain in his domain had to spout colored water. Alchemists dyed the water in bright neon shades: green, pink, blue, orange. Each fountain had its own hue. Travelers arrived to see an otherwise regal city splashed with fluorescent sprays. Some dyes stained clothes and skin, leaving passers-by covered in strange blotches. But the king raved about the vivid display, insisting it showed off the realm's vitality. He was enthralled by the concept of living forever. He declared that nobody should utter the word end, punishable by a hefty fine. Citizens had to invent phrases like the long pause of existence for funerals. Writers had to eliminate end from their works, using clumsy synonyms. At festivals, people avoided speaking about anything concluding. Instead, they said, "The festival transforms into a memory." The entire realm twisted language to tiptoe around a single banned word. He also assigned random dates to the seasons, disregarding any actual changes in weather. If he woke up one morning and decided winter was over, he ordered immediate gatherings to celebrate the start of spring, even if snow still coated the streets. Farmers pleaded for accurate guidance, but the king waved them off, stating, "Nature follows me." The harvest suffered, and discontent spread, but fear kept protests at bay. As time wore on, the raised walkways rotted, the white walls stained, and the swirling architecture became a jumbled mess. People navigated a kingdom built on illusions and impulsive commands, where logic took a back seat to a single man's chaotic vision. Yet he saw none of it. In his eyes, the realm sparkled with brilliance and pulsed with unstoppable energy. And so, day after day, he carried on, certain that his ways were beyond criticism, convinced that he alone possessed the wisdom to guide them all. He woke one morning convinced his shadow had stolen his voice. Panicked, he summoned every court physician, demanding they examine his silhouette. The physicians stood in confusion, trying to explain there was no way a shadow could speak. But the king persisted. He forced them to shine bright lights from every angle, peering at his outline on the floor. When no sign of mischief appeared, he accused them of conspiring against him. He told the scribes to record every word his shadow might whisper during the day. So a small group followed him around, scribbling furiously on parchment whenever his shadow moved. Sometimes a breeze made the shape flicker, and the king gasped, convinced it was silently mocking him. The scribes nodded politely, jotting down meaningless squiggles that they pretended were shadow language. Courtiers tiptoed around, avoiding any mention of the absurdity. These peculiar allusions spilled into his foreign policy. He decided that if his shadow had turned traitorous, other kingdoms' shadows must be plotting as well. He sent out emissaries with instructions to inspect the shadows of foreign rulers. Needless to say, these emissaries faced baffled stares and sometimes outright hostility. One neighboring monarch threw them out, calling the notion a sign of madness. But the king took that as proof. They are hiding something behind their shadows. At the same time, he ordered all portraits in the palace to be changed, so that they showed each subject's shadow in front rather than behind. Painters tried to comply, twisting perspective in ways that made little sense. The resulting images looked warped, as if people were stepping on giant silhouettes. The king praised it as a breakthrough in shadow awareness, while visitors complained of headaches just trying to interpret the bizarre art. He held an emergency council meeting, claiming the kingdom's future depended on discovering how to control shadows. Advisors from every department gathered around a long table, expecting a serious discussion about trade or defense. Instead, the king flung open the doors and yelled, "We must harness the darkness at our feet." Dead silence followed, broken only by the rustling of quills as scribes noted his outburst. A seasoned official tried to direct the conversation toward practical matters, but the king cut him off, throwing a wooden goblet and roaring, "Your ignorance threatens our survival." In a fit of urgency, he established the Department of Shadow Control. Its only task was to document the length, shape, and behavior of shadows across the land. Inspectors marched through villages, measuring shadows at different times of day. Townsfolk were forced to stand still while these strangers circled them with rulers and chalk. Records piled up in the new office, stacks of papers with scribbled notes like "Farmer's shadow at noon, short and stubby, no sign of rebellion." Officials grumbled that it was all meaningless, but the king was convinced this data would save the realm. During one festival, he insisted that everyone dance backward to confuse their shadows. Musicians were told to play cheerful tunes, while citizens stumbled in reverse. People collided, tricked, and toppled over. Children cried, old folks gave up, and the entire event turned chaotic. Yet the king applauded, shouting, "Look how disoriented the shadows are now." Courtiers pretended to see the truth in his claim, though most were simply relieved when the festival ended. He developed a habit of blaming any small mishap on the shadows. If a cup spilled, he snarled at the floor. If a door creaked, he accused the silhouette behind it. If a messenger arrived late, the king insisted that the man's shadow had slowed him down. This mania escalated until he banned open flames at night, claiming that flickering torchlight let shadows shift in suspicious ways. The palace became dimly lit by a few dull lanterns, making hallways eerie and dangerous to navigate. Servants grumbled about stubbing toes on steps they could barely see. His obsession became even more outrageous when he decided to recruit an army of shadow hunters. These individuals carried large nets and bizarre devices designed to catch shadows against walls or on the ground. They prowled the palace, lunging at any moving outline, only to end up looking ridiculous. The king oversaw their training personally, nodding in approval whenever a guard pounced on someone's silhouette. This charade terrified the staff, who had to freeze whenever a shadow hunter rushed at them, net in hand. At the same time, he announced that certain shadows showed signs of loyalty and should be rewarded. This led to the strangest court ceremony, the knighthood of loyal silhouettes. People stood before the throne while torches cast their silhouettes on a white backdrop. If the king liked the shape, he pronounced the shadow a knight. He pinned tiny badges at the shadow's chest level on the backdrop, as if bestowing medals. The real person received nothing. They just stood there, baffled, while the audience clapped politely. The newly dubbed Shadow Knight might vanish the moment the person stepped away from the light. Alongside this fiasco, he neglected more practical aspects of governance. Roads crumbled, markets lost trade, and bandits prowled the countryside. But the king only had eyes for shadows. When complaints reached his ears, he waved them off, saying, "Once the shadows are tamed, everything will be fine." Eventually, local officials started handling problems on their own, ignoring the palace. Word spread that the monarchy had descended into illusions, and people had little choice but to fend for themselves. He also banned the color black in an attempt to weaken shadows. Tailors, artisans, and merchants scrambled to remove black dyes from all products. Charcoal sketches were outlawed. Cooks had to avoid foods that turned dark when baked or grilled. Nighttime guards were forced to wear white uniforms that made them stand out in the darkness, completely defeating any stealth. Citizens had to hide their black clothing or risk confiscation. The entire realm looked like an overlit stage where everyone dressed in pale colors, stumbling around half-blinded in gloom. He redecorated the throne room in pure white stone, installing mirrored ceilings to reflect any lurking shadows upward. He sat on a shimmering seat, scanning the floors for any silhouette that dared approach him. Courtiers trying to speak with him found themselves caught in weird lighting angles, creating contorted shapes on the floor. The king frowned at these shapes, suspecting them of harboring ill intent. Ministers tried to approach only when the light was angled so their shadows stayed out of sight. One of the strangest policies involved shadow shaming. Whenever an official made a mistake, the king forced them to carry a cutout silhouette of a donkey around the palace for a full day. This cutout was pinned to their clothes, trailing behind them as a mock shadow. He believed this public humiliation would teach them to be more vigilant. The officials seethed, but dared not revolt. Some petty courtiers used the moment to jeer at rivals, enjoying the spectacle. It grew worse when he turned to architecture. He commanded the construction of shadowless towers, claiming they would cast no outlines at certain times of day. Builders scratched their heads, trying to interpret these insane blueprints. The king insisted on bizarre angles and slanted walls designed to minimize shadows under the midday sun. The final structures were precarious monstrosities that looked like they might topple at any moment. Passers-by kept their distance, fearing a deadly collapse. Yet the king pointed to them with pride, bragging that his towers defied nature. He insisted that every street be lined with bright lamps, powered by massive amounts of oil or candle wax. This drained resources the kingdom needed for other essentials. Merchants struggled to import enough supplies for the never-ending demand. Families found their taxes spiking to finance the mania, while the king walked at night through artificially lit roads, exclaiming, "The shadows dare not come here." In his personal chambers, he placed glowing crystals in every corner, rumored to be fragments of a fallen star. Scientists, or what passed for them in his court, said these crystals were just fancy rocks carved and polished. The king refused to believe them. He claimed the crystals repelled shadowy forces, letting him sleep soundly. Some nights, he woke from nightmares, screaming at the foot of his bed, convinced a shadow creature had tried to grab him. Guards rushed in, only to find him shaking his fist at empty air. He believed illusions were no longer enough. He needed to physically hurt any shadow that threatened him. So he ordered blacksmiths to forge shadow swords, weapons with odd hooks and prongs. Allegedly, these swords could slice through darkness itself. Soldiers held them awkwardly, unsure how to use them. The king demanded drills in which they lunged at silhouettes cast on castle walls. Everyone felt ridiculous except the king, who roared, "Cut them down," while waving his own bizarre blade. When news came that a distant region was suffering a drought, he offered help by dispatching shadow specialists to investigate if darkness was blocking the rain. Villagers in that region looked on, dumbfounded, as these specialists set up mirrors, reflective shields, and bright lamps across the withered fields. Of course, it changed nothing. Crops still withered, the drought persisted, but the king claimed victory, announcing that his people had driven out the shadow dryness, even though no real solution arrived. He alienated foreign allies further by accusing them of harboring shadow spies. He demanded that all visiting envoys stand in direct sunlight for hours so he could watch their silhouettes for suspicious activity. Diplomats complained of heat exhaustion, but the king refused to let them step into shade. Some collapsed, while others simply turned around and left, deciding no deal was worth enduring such madness. The king concluded that their hasty exit proved their shadows had something to hide. His love of bizarre ceremonies reached a new height with the Solar Purge, a massive event where people had to parade through the capital under the hottest midday sun. He believed that intense light would banish any lurking shadow demons. Citizens marched in sweaty misery, clutching fans and water skins. Children wailed from the scorching heat. The king rode in a covered chariot, ironically shielded from the sun, while praising the bravery of his subjects. He waved to the panting crowds as if bestowing them with divine favor. He soon decided that those who had particularly large shadows posed a higher risk. Taller individuals, or those standing at certain angles, found themselves singled out. He made them kneel so their shadows wouldn't stretch too far. Some were told to crouch at all times whenever in the king's presence. This humiliating rule crushed the morale of many, but nobody dared protest. They complied, shuffling around in half-bent postures, eyes lowered to avoid his suspicious gaze. He started a nightly broadcast from his balcony, shouting shadow alerts through a giant horn. He warned the populace of uprisings in the darkness, urging everyone to sleep with lamps burning. People groaned as they heard his voice echo across the city, disturbing their rest. Candle prices soared, and the city glowed like an unnatural beacon at night. Travelers could see it from miles away, describing the eerie sight of a kingdom that never truly slept. At one point, rumors spread that an underground movement was forming, a group that planned to overthrow him. He responded by commanding the entire palace staff to strip off their shoes, claiming the sound of footsteps made it easier for shadows to coordinate attacks. So, the palace turned into a place of silent, barefoot servants sliding across polished floors. Whenever the king heard a squeak or scuff, he'd accuse someone of shadow collusion. The tension grew so thick that many staff members fled in the night, leaving behind valuable positions just to escape his paranoia. Not content with punishing just humans, he turned his madness on architecture itself. He outlawed overhangs that cast large shadows. Owners of buildings with wide rooftops had to demolish or reshape them. City streets became a construction zone with half-finished roofs and structures altered to let more sunlight through. The result was a patchwork of ugly, mismatched facades and leaky homes whenever rain fell. But the king beamed, convinced he was winning the war against lurking darkness. He introduced new punishments for anyone caught shadow meddling. The strangest involved wearing a huge, hollow cylinder over the body, a sun barrel, so that direct sunlight poured in, preventing any shadow from forming on the person's skin. These punished individuals looked like walking barrels with arms and legs sticking out. They had to shuffle around in public for a day, ridiculed by onlookers. The king believed such shame taught them never to trust the darkness again. In the midst of all this chaos, his finance ministers tried to salvage the economy. They suggested reforms, but the king roared that coin shortages were the shadows' doing. He forced them to hold meetings at noon in the open courtyard, so he could watch their outlines. If their shadows fell in a certain way, he claimed it was a sign of deceit. Some ministers tried to stand in groups to blur their shadows. He noticed and banished them for conspiracy by silhouette. That left the realm with fewer capable officials. He refused to travel outside the palace walls unless the route was heavily lit by torches, even in broad daylight. Thousands of torches lined his procession path, carried by sweating peasants. Bright flames scorched the air, sending up plumes of thick smoke. Towns stank of burnt wood for days. People coughed, but the king pressed on, sure he was protecting himself from hidden shapes. He even had a special canopy built over his carriage, fitted with mirrors underneath, so no shadow could form on the ground. His illusions reached a comedic peak when he staged a shadow trial. He placed a large cloth figure on a stand, calling it the shadow accused. It was supposedly the embodiment of every traitorous silhouette. He ranted at the dummy for hours, listing the realm's woes. Then, with great drama, he found it guilty, sentencing it to be exiled beyond the sunrise. Soldiers ceremoniously hauled the limp cloth figure out of the city gates. The king declared victory, certain he had rid the kingdom of the ultimate threat. Despite this bizarre triumph, the kingdom struggled under the weight of failed policies and nonsensible orders. Shadows, of course, never went away. People carried on, stepping carefully, moving with caution. They had grown used to life in a constant state of enforced brightness. And the king still soared on his illusions, seeing conspiracies in every faint outline. Each day brought new, baffling decrees that chipped away at the realm's sanity. Yet nobody could talk sense into a ruler who believed every dance of darkness was part of a grand betrayal. As he paraded through his bright corridors, guards in mirror-polished helmets saluting, it seemed there was no limit to how far he would go. He blustered and boasted, smiling at the reflection of his own face, convinced that only he understood the hidden war lurking in every corner. His subjects kept their heads low, hoping not to catch his eye. For in this upside-down kingdom, where shadows were enemies and sunlight was a weapon, normal life had all but vanished under the glare of one man's outlandish obsession. He lounged in the royal bath while a chorus of servants fanned him with giant palm leaves. Suddenly, he leapt out, water sloshing everywhere, screaming about invisible blades slicing the air around him. Everyone froze, horrified by this explosive panic. So began another day in the kingdom of a ruler whose mind was full of constantly shifting terrors and whims. He was convinced that unseen knives floated through the palace, waiting to cut down anyone who showed doubt about his grand ideas. Courtiers had no clue how to respond. They tiptoed through corridors, holding pillows in front of them, just in case an invisible blade lurked nearby. The king demanded every servant wear a layer of thick padding under their clothes. Each morning, tailors scrambled to distribute stuffed vests and bulky wraps, giving the entire court a puffed-up, ridiculous look. This ruler also believed the entire realm should be shaped in his likeness. He erected huge statues of himself at every city gate, each figure carved in ridiculous detail, wide eyes, flaring nostrils, and an enormous grin. People entering these gates felt they were stepping into a land under the watchful gaze of a man who found himself far too intriguing. At night, torches lit these statues from below, creating monstrous shadows that loomed over travelers. Merchants complained that it frightened customers, but the king insisted it projected his unstoppable presence. He insisted that each statue had a magical link to him. If someone defaced even a finger of a statue, he claimed to feel a stabbing pain. So, he formed a special patrol unit to guard his likenesses, armed with nets and horns. Anytime someone so much as brushed against the stone, horns blared, and the guards pounced. People learned to pass the statues with eyes down, hands clasped behind their backs, lest they be accused of sabotage. This only fueled more tension and suspicion among citizens. His grand hall became a zone of perpetual spectacle. He loved bizarre performances. On one occasion, he forced the ministers of trade and agriculture to dress in matching clown suits and juggle fruit while discussing policy. The poor officials, humiliated, tried to outline the year's harvest problems between flying oranges and apples. The king found this hilarious, clapping excitedly as fruit soared through the air. No real progress was made on trade or farming, but he called it a productive meeting. He was equally erratic with religious practices. He regularly changed the official days of worship, sometimes holding ceremonies every third day, other times skipping entire weeks. Priests had to spin bizarre stories to explain these sudden shifts. At a special temple he built, he introduced a half-baked ritual where worshippers had to tie ribbons around their ankles and hop in circles. He believed this brought good fortune. People complied nervously, afraid to displease a king who might see any hesitation as disloyalty. He had a giant drum installed in every public square. Randomly, at any hour, he'd send a messenger to beat the drum 3 times. Citizens had to pause whatever they were doing, stand still, and applaud the absent king. This silly custom disrupted daily life. Markets paused during trades, blacksmiths halted mid-swing, and children froze mid-play. The drum's echo reverberated through the kingdom, a constant reminder of his never-ending hunger for attention. Meanwhile, his personal amusements took priority over everything else. He formed a private menagerie, claiming he had spiritual connections with exotic creatures, lions, zebras, strange birds, and even a shy platypus from distant shores roamed the palace grounds. He assigned each creature a rank in court, handing out mock titles like Count Claw for a lion and Baron Quack for a large goose. Real nobles had to bow to these animals when passing by, a sight that sparked endless muttered complaints. His mealtime habits grew more bizarre with each passing month. He insisted on using spoons carved from meteorites, believing they carried cosmic power. He forced his kitchen staff to serve food in edible bowls made of compacted grains, so no dish or utensil was wasted. This created messy, soggy situations. Soup soaked through these grain bowls onto the tables, and roasts crumbled the bowls upon contact. But the king wouldn't back down, praising himself as an environmental visionary while servants mopped endlessly. He also established a rotating system of top advisors. Each month, he demoted the current ones and replaced them with random courtiers, jesters, or even stable hands. He believed fresh minds brought fresh ideas, ignoring the chaos of inexperienced people handling crucial decisions. The realm's administration became a circus of confusion, with new folks stammering at official meetings, clueless about their duties. Meanwhile, the king reveled in the upheaval, patting himself on the back for breaking stagnation. Paranoia oozed into his approach to health. He banned the color red from the palace, convinced it triggered hidden fevers that would consume him. All red garments, rugs, tapestries, and even fruit were removed. People tiptoed around with drab attire, and if a visitor wore a red hat, the king shrieked as if they'd unleashed a plague. One day, a messenger arrived with a red wax seal on a document, and the king nearly fainted. Guards quickly cut away the seal, burned it, and had the messenger scrubbed head to toe in herbal water. Even more shocking, he mandated that all citizens keep a written record of their dreams. Once a week, collectors went door to door, gathering these dream diaries. Anyone who hadn't written a dream risked punishment. The king claimed he had scholars decipher these dreams for patterns that might threaten his reign. The backlog of bizarre nightmares, fantasies, and random sleep thoughts became an absurd library. Rumor had it the king occasionally browsed random diaries, laughing at the strangeness of people's subconscious fears. He also fixated on certain words he deemed unlucky. If he overheard them, he flew into a rage. Examples included rust, cricket, and tunnel. Why these words? Nobody knew. Ministers tried to develop synonyms or code phrases, But inevitably someone slipped up. The punishment might be cleaning the palace courtyard with a toothbrush, or wearing a giant cone hat labeled "Caution" for an entire day. Over time, everyday speech became peppered with awkward pauses as people struggled to avoid cursed words. One day, he woke up declaring he had found a hidden realm within the palace walls. He marched around, knocking on every panel and tapestry, insisting there must be secret doorways. Builders had to carve out entire sections of walls, searching for non-existent passageways. When they uncovered nothing but dust, he claimed the realm had magically moved elsewhere. Undeterred, he ordered a daily realm check, with officials tapping walls and floors, pressing their ears against them, hoping to hear mystical echoes. This charade continued for months. Despite the confusion, he seemed unstoppable in his mania for new laws. He once decreed that every citizen must compose a short poem praising his eyebrows. The entire kingdom groaned, searching for rhymes that would pass muster. Town criers called out the new mandate, and locals scrambled to produce verses about eyebrows being grand like the evening sky or strong like the mountain's edge. Most of these poems made no sense, but they satisfied the bizarre requirement. His appetite for superstition led him to outlaw stepping on cracks in the pavement. He dispatched crack monitors who patrolled public walkways, fining anyone who inadvertently stepped on a crack. Cities soon saw strange patterns of people hopping or tiptoeing around, trying to avoid the smallest line in the stones. Merchants complained that customers avoided busy areas out of fear of stepping wrong, hurting sales. But the king refused to reconsider, sure that cracks unleashed negative spirits. His personality flipped from glee to fury in a heartbeat. One moment he roared with laughter at a comedic puppet show. Seconds later he erupted in anger at the puppet's outfit, tossing the puppeteer in jail for degrading the monarchy. People lived on edge, never sure which mood the king would have in the next 5 minutes. If a court jester told a joke, the entire room held its breath, hoping the king wouldn't twist it into an insult. He demanded the creation of massive clay sculptures that celebrated odd body parts, ears, knees, elbows, placed at intervals along roads. He claimed these served as reminders of human fragility. Foreign visitors were baffled to see towering clay knees or giant sculpted ears looming along trade routes. Locals shrugged, used to such sights by now. The sculptures often cracked in bad weather or collapsed into lumpy ruins. The king simply ordered new ones. Convinced their presence guarded the kingdom against invisible curses. Music, too, fell under his control. He declared that all songs must include at least one random scream to signify the shock of reality. Bards and troubadours dreaded performing for him, knowing they had to insert a sudden shriek. Audiences never got used to it, flinching each time the scream pierced an otherwise melodic tune. The king, however, tapped his foot happily, praising the thrilling element. He had added to the arts. He set up something called the Hall of Traded Identities, where people could swap names for a day. He believed this created social harmony, as nobody would be stuck in their own destiny. Commoners traded names with nobles, soldiers with scholars, bakers with blacksmiths. It created utter mayhem in official records. Who was who on any given day? The confusion delighted the king, who said it showed the kingdom's flexibility. Even the simplest tasks turned complicated. He didn't trust normal wagons to transport goods, so he made them attach giant wings to the sides, claiming it would lighten the burden on the horses. Of course, these wooden wings added weight and drag, causing wagons to move slower. Horses tired quickly, and cargo arrivals were delayed. The king waved away complaints, insisting that the wagons looked more majestic, which in his mind was worth any inconvenience. He was easily dazzled by odd illusions. A traveling magician once performed a simple card trick, and the king deemed it real magic, believing the man could conjure storms. Immediately, he forced the magician to join his court, naming him Lord of Weather. Anytime the skies failed to produce rain, he blamed this unfortunate performer, threatening him with exile if he didn't summon clouds. The terrified magician performed frantic illusions, but never actually changed the weather. He also developed an obsession with spirals. He wanted them in every piece of architecture, from rooftops to door handles. Craftsmen had to carve endless loops into doors, balustrades, even the floors. Visitors stumbled on swirling patterns that made them dizzy. The king adored it, saying spirals represented the unfolding of cosmic truth. People dreaded new building projects, knowing they'd have to incorporate spirals, no matter how structurally impractical. His approach to warfare was a swirling madness, too. He replaced war drums with giant horns shaped like flamingos. Soldiers found them unwieldy and silly. On the battlefield, the horns sounded like squawking birds, confusing both allies and enemies. The king called it psychological warfare, ignoring the laughter it provoked among opposing troops. Generals quietly fumed, but he dismissed them if they questioned his methods. On a whim, he'd tear through city streets at midnight with a large group of drummers, rattling windows, startling sleeping families. He called these loyalty parades, expecting people to rush outside and cheer him on. Most folks hid indoors, feigning slumber. If he saw a dark window, he called the occupant disloyal, sometimes ordering mild punishments, like having them recite flattering verses in the public square. His palace library was another victim of mania. He scattered the books on the floor, ordering a random arrangement so people had to wander through piles, blindly searching for what they needed. Librarians tried to organize them, but the king accused them of stifling creativity. He even tossed seeds among the books, hoping plants might grow and bind knowledge with nature. The place turned into a messy jungle of rotting seeds, half-sprouting vines, and tattered pages. Scholars gave up, seeing no use in that chaos. He also had a strange obsession with repeating daily tasks 3 times. If he signed a document, he had to sign it twice more, at different angles. If he gave a speech, he repeated each sentence thrice, no matter how long or boring. The entire court endured triple greetings, triple goodbyes, triple orders. Scribes had to copy official proclamations thrice as well. The wasted time was enormous, but the king insisted it brought depth and certainty to every action. In private, he consulted with supposed psychics who read meaning in the swirl of tea leaves or the shape of bread crusts. If a crust resembled a castle tower, he'd order a new fortress built. If tea leaves formed something vaguely bird-like, he'd demand the entire court wear feathers. His unpredictability left ministers in a perpetual state of anxiety, wondering what nonsense might strike next. He sometimes held silent meals, banning everyone from speaking while they ate. At any random moment, though, he'd leap up, bang a gong and scream, "Speak now or lose your voice forever." Those who remained silent risked offending him. Those who spoke up risked saying something he didn't like. It was a dreadful tightrope for participants. He found it delightful, claiming he could glimpse true loyalty in their eyes. He eventually declared a new official motto, "My mind is the crown." This replaced previous mottos he'd whimsically concocted. He plastered it everywhere, on banners, plates, even livestock brands. Citizens had to chant it at public events. He roamed the streets in disguise, listening for anyone who failed to recite it correctly. Those who stumbled over the words found themselves cleaning palace floors with rags, while the king strolled by, humming in self-approval. Through all this, the kingdom survived, though just barely. Local communities adapted to his mania by handling matters quietly, ignoring bizarre mandates when possible. But the king's watchful eyes and ears were everywhere. He refused to relinquish control, too busy building new illusions, staging new spectacles, and punishing perceived traitors. As the years dragged on, the realm sagged under the weight of constant nonsense, while he basked in the glow of his own extravagant fantasies. No matter the turmoil, he never saw himself as anything less than a visionary. Standing on balconies lined with statues of bizarre creatures, wearing robes embroidered with images of his own face, he looked upon a kingdom teetering on the edge of absurdity. And yet to him, everything was perfect, each day an exciting chance to impose new ideas and games on his helpless subjects. Thus, life marched on in a swirl of confusion, fear, and forced amusement, all under the watch of a monarch whose imagination had run wild. He believed the wind sang hymns in his honor. On stormy days he climbed atop the tallest tower, stretching his arms wide, letting the gusts whip his cloak. Servants below watched, terrified he might be blown away. He hollered down, "Hear that chorus? It shouts my praises." Everyone pretended to hear the same glorious melody, clapping awkwardly. Then, with a grandiose pose, he hopped back onto safer ground, ordering scribes to record what he called wind-given revelations. Unlike other rulers who had armies of well-trained guards, he surrounded himself with an entourage of individuals he called air whisperers. These strange folks carried wind chimes, flutes, and spinning trinkets. Their job? Interpret every breeze that blew through the palace. When a draft passed by, they listened closely, making random claims like, "The eastern corridor longs for new drapes." The king nodded, convinced these were hidden messages from an invisible realm. One day he announced a law that all citizens must build small windmills on their roofs. He believed the combined spinning of these windmills would elevate the kingdom to a higher spiritual plane. Craftsmen scrambled to produce thousands of tiny windmills, shipping them to towns far and wide. Soon, the skyline shimmered with spinning blades, creaking noisily. Many complained about the racket and the cost, but the king was thrilled, beaming that his domain was alive with constant motion. He also insisted that daily life revolve around wind schedules. Markets opened only when the morning breeze blew from the north, and schools began lessons if the midday gust came from the west. The moment the wind direction shifted, bells rang, halting all activity. Storekeepers had to shut their stalls, teachers dismissed classes, and travelers paused their journeys. The entire kingdom's routine bounced unpredictably, ruled by shifting breezes that cared nothing for human timetables. This king was notorious for hoarding feathers from various birds. He declared that these plumes harnessed wind power. Hallways overflowed with sacks of them, sorted by color or size, shedding fluff everywhere. Courtiers sneezed constantly. Each audience with him featured a bizarre backdrop of swirling feathers caught in stray drafts. He wore cloaks adorned with them, claiming they let him merge with the wind. Yet to onlookers, he looked like a messy peacock that had wandered into the palace by mistake. He tried to convert the stables to wind stables, believing horses could gallop faster if the walls were lined with spinning fans. Grooms complained that the noise spooked the animals, causing them to buck and kick. The king brushed it off, claiming the horses needed to adapt. Eventually, some unlucky stable hands got trampled, prompting them to quit or flee. The king then fired any stable staff who criticized his grand wind-based innovations, leaving a skeleton crew to manage the panicked horses. His outlandishness extended to public ceremonies too. At one festival, he had hundreds of participants stand in a giant circle, holding fans. They waved these fans in unison to create a massive swirl of air around him. He closed his eyes, swaying dramatically, as though absorbing cosmic power. Spectators grew dizzy, many fainting from the heat and exertion. He took that as proof of his growing aura, crowing about the wind magic he commanded. Physicians discreetly helped the fallen, rolling their eyes. He was fixated on hairdos as well. Anyone in the palace had to keep their hair styled in a way that allowed wind to pass through easily. Braids and buns were discouraged. Loose, flowing locks became mandatory. Men who tried to tie their hair back in the scorching heat were reprimanded for blocking wind synergy. This vain rule annoyed nearly everyone. Stylists popped up everywhere, offering wind-friendly cuts, shaping odd angles that fluttered at the slightest breeze. Bald courtiers simply had to wave miniature fans above their heads to demonstrate commitment. He despised stagnant air, so he commanded the palace walls be fitted with hundreds of vents, windows, and gaps, no matter the weather. Rain poured in, chilling drafts swept corridors, and dust storms coated furniture. But he refused to seal the openings, insisting that fresh air must circulate freely. Officials complained about mold, damp floors, and destroyed records. He argued that these were trivial sacrifices in the quest for ultimate wind harmony. People sneezed and coughed constantly, but his mind was set. Local engineers tried to reason with him when he commissioned a colossal wind harp as tall as the royal tower. They warned it would require enormous amounts of rare wood and metal. Undeterred, he allocated a fortune to the project. The result was a massive structure with countless strings. When strong gales blew, it emitted eerie wails heard throughout the capital. Children cried at night, and older folks dreaded storms. The king, however, described these sounds as celestial lullabies, drifting off to sleep with a smile. He also lodged a bizarre wind academy, forcing students to study swirling patterns of dust and leaves. These unfortunate youngsters spent hours in courtyards, tracking every gust's direction. Teachers had no standard curriculum. They improvised lessons on kite flying, feather floating, or cloud shaping illusions. The king visited often, walking among them, declaring he was forging a generation of wind-savvy geniuses. Meanwhile, actual literacy and arithmetic plummeted. Some parents rebelled, but the king labeled them enemies of progress. In the council chambers, he demanded that ministers plan national policies using wind reading. They'd release handfuls of flour into the air, then interpret how it scattered. This technique caused flour to coat their robes and the polished floors, making everyone look like ghosts. The king would stroke his chin, proclaiming that a swirl near the eastern corner meant boosting taxes in certain provinces. Officials tried to glean logic from the nonsense. The realm lurched from one policy to another, guided by white clouds of drifting powder. His paranoia also found a foothold in the wind. He insisted certain breezes carried messages from unknown enemies. Soldiers were stationed on high ridges to listen for threatening signals. People joked in whispers about the possibility of wind-based espionage. But if the king heard any humor at his expense, he flew into a rage, ordering random arrests. Soon, jokes vanished, replaced by forced seriousness about the potential dangers of malicious gusts. He commanded the kingdom's priests to create a new wind-centric religion. Ancient temples were refitted with wind chimneys, huge flutes, and rotating altars that never stayed still. Rituals included chasing tumbleweeds around courtyards. The faithful had to blow horns at sunrise to salute the dawn gust. Traditional beliefs were sidelined in favor of these swirling customs. Many participants only pretended enthusiasm, fearing punishment if they didn't conform. The king, of course, saw only devoted worship. On the domestic side, he demanded that all meals be wind-perfumed, instructing cooks to wave dishes through fresh air before serving. Hot soup cooled instantly, while bread dried out, turning stale. Dinners became lukewarm and bland, but no one dared complain. He claimed these wind-kissed meals enhanced vitality. Some resourceful chefs learned to briefly open windows near the kitchen, letting a breeze pass by, just enough to satisfy the rule without ruining the food entirely. He took the throne to new heights of lunacy when he decided the entire royal palace must ascend into the sky on columns of hot air. Engineers tried to explain the impossibility. He refused to listen, forcing them to build enormous furnaces below the palace's foundation, hoping to lift it like a balloon. Predictably, nothing happened except wasted fuel and cracked floors from the heat. The king labeled the engineers incompetent, replacing them with dreamers who told him what he wanted to hear. His edicts on personal grooming were endless. Everyone had to carry a bottle of scented oils to spray into any gust that passed them. The air reeked of mixed perfumes, rose, lavender, musk, blended into an overpowering stench. People coughed, eyes watering, but he insisted that pleasing aromas placated the wind spirits. Shops selling oils popped up on every corner, driving up prices and draining pockets. The king called this an economic triumph, ignoring the widespread discomfort. He introduced a new form of punishment called the wind cage. Wrongdoers were locked in a metal cage suspended high above the ground, buffeted by strong breezes. Day and night, they swayed, battered by storms or baked by the sun. The king visited sometimes, shouting up at them, "Learn from the wind's lesson." Many emerged from the cage disoriented, sick, and traumatized, yet he saw it as a brilliant method to reform criminals. He even forbade certain hairstyles if they didn't flap dramatically in the wind. Courtiers forced their hair into wave-like shapes, hoping to pass the king's random inspections. If he saw someone's hair too stiff, he'd bark, "Windless fool," and demand they fix it immediately. Guards carried combs and sprays, ready to style detainees on the spot. Ridiculous scenes played out in palace corridors, with grown men and women getting emergency blowouts to appease their ruler's windy obsession. He believed each person's name should have a breezy quality. so he made everyone add a letter S or Z somewhere. Formal records became a mess. People stumbled over their own new names, forgetting how they were spelled. The confusion in documentation turned nightmarish. Land deeds, birth registers, marriage certificates, all teetered on chaos. Yet the king's scribes revised everything, proud to serve their enlightened monarch. Among his odd habits, he performed daily wind blessings on random objects. He'd blow on them, saying, "May the breeze grant you strength." Courtiers lined up with personal belongings, a sword, a ring, a hat, hoping to gain favor. He believed each blow transferred cosmic wind energy. If an item broke later, he accused the owner of poor faith. This created a cycle of fear-driven devotion, as everyone vied for his airy blessings. Architecture across the land bore his mark. He demanded swirling towers, open-air corridors, and rotating platforms that never quite worked. Buildings often collapsed in strong weather, ironically failing to withstand the very winds they were built to celebrate. Villagers complained of rotting frameworks and poorly designed spiral ramps. The king shrugged off these problems, convinced that any structural flaws were due to impure hearts lacking true wind devotion. One horrifying moment arrived when he insisted on launching wind hunts. Groups of armed men galloped across fields, chasing invisible currents. They flailed nets, hacking at swirling dust devils. Peasants fled in terror at the approaching cavalry, not wanting to be mistaken for a hostile breeze. The hunts produced no real prey, just trampled crops and traumatized locals. But the king exalted these spectacles as proof of his unstoppable dominion over the air itself. He had a special banquet tradition where guests had to speak only in sighs and soft exhalations. The resulting dinner sounded like a mass of exhausted people. Ha, ooh, ah, with plates clinking. It was both eerie and comical. He found it mesmerizing, claiming it connected everyone to the wind's language. By the meal's end, guests were lightheaded from so much exaggerated breathing. Yet they wore forced smiles, praising his visionary brilliance. He introduced a Wind Olympics, featuring absurd sports like feather carrying and gust chasing. Competitors had to hold feathers in the air as long as possible or race after unpredictable breezes with nets. Spectators watched in puzzled silence, though the king roared encouragement from a lavish balcony. Winners received trophies shaped like swirling gusts. Everyone else left sweaty, panting, and questioning the sanity of such events. Matters of state all but vanished under his swirling mania. Hunger rose in rural areas as he diverted funds to massive wind-themed projects. Roads crumbled while stonemasons were forced to build decorative wind monuments instead. Whenever complaints reached him, he dismissed them as static negativity. He claimed the wind would provide if people opened their souls. Unsurprisingly, the wind did not provide crops, shelter, or healthcare. Dissent grew, but fear kept it quiet. He sponsored traveling bards who praised the wind's majesty. They composed ballads about gentle breezes, raging gales, and the king's unmatched bond with both. Town squares echoed with these songs, hammered into the people's heads day and night. Some believed he tried to brainwash everyone into worshipping gusts. Yet ironically, a few found solace in these tunes, humming them softly while carrying out daily chores. It was an odd attempt to find comfort in the midst of lunacy. Though chaos reigned, he never faltered in his conviction. He stood in grand halls, arms raised, eyes closed, feeling the slightest draft as if it were a personal omen. Courtiers feared his unpredictability, but they also felt an odd fascination with his unshakable, if warped, faith. Each day brought fresh madness, wind taxes, breezy parades, or mandatory hair-fluffing sessions. The realm spun like a leaf in a whirlwind, powerless against the gusts of his imagination. Still, in his mind, all was in perfect harmony. He believed that the swirling air validated his rule, that the flutter of a banner proved his synergy with the cosmos. The people kept quiet, bowing their heads when he passed in cloaks made of rustling feathers. And so, as dust devils danced along crooked roads and battered windmills creaked on rooftops, life continued under the rule of a king who put all his faith in the erratic whisper of the wind.